Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something that doesn't always get the attention it deserves, but it's really becoming more and more important in international relations. And that is the role of gender. Especially for those of you out there who are UPSC aspirants, prepping for the international relations paper, this deep dive is really for you.
Absolutely. For decades, the study of international relations has been kind of dominated by this idea of power politics and states being the main actors. But when we don't consider the influence of gender, we end up with a picture of what's shaping the world that just isn't complete.
It's like we've been trying to put together a puzzle, but we've been missing some crucial pieces. So how do different schools of thought in international relations approach gender? What are some of those missing pieces that we need to find?
Well, let's start with realism, which is one of the most well-known theories in international relations. Realists tend to see states as like these single units, all driven by this very rational pursuit of what they consider to be their national interests. And they see the international system as this kind of anarchic free-for-all where power and security are the most important things.
So from a realist perspective, all the stuff that's happening inside a state like the gender dynamics wouldn't really have much impact out there on the world stage.
Exactly. They often use what we call the black box analogy, where what's going on inside the state is considered basically irrelevant to how it behaves out in the world. So, for example, they might say a country decides to go to war based on cold strategic calculations, not because of the gender of the person leading it.
But wouldn't you say that's a little bit of an oversimplification? I mean, leaders, regardless of their gender, they're shaped by social norms and cultural contexts, right?
Right.
And those things have to impact their decision-making. So if we ignore those internal factors, wouldn't we be missing out on understanding why a state does what it does?
That's a really good point. And that's where some of the other perspectives come in. Liberalism, for example, offers a very different lens through which to view gender in international relations.
Right. With liberalism, you have that strong focus on individual rights and freedoms and advocating for equality no matter what gender you are. So they'd probably argue that if we had more women in leadership positions, it would make global politics better.
Exactly. And that's where liberal feminism comes in. It's rooted in liberal thought, and it pushes for men and women to have the same opportunities, particularly when it comes to participating in politics and making decisions. It emphasizes things like legal reforms and institutional changes that are needed to really achieve gender equality.
So basically, while realists might say gender doesn't matter, liberals see it as super important for creating a more just and peaceful world order. But what about those who critique both realism and liberalism? Where do they stand on all this?
That's where things get really interesting. Critical theories offer a more nuanced and, to be honest, more complex understanding of how gender plays out in international relations.
Okay, listeners, I have a feeling this is where we're going to have some light bulb moments. So let's dive into these critical perspectives.
Sounds good. One of the big ones is social constructivism. Social constructivists say that gender isn't purely biological. They argue it's socially constructed by all the norms, values, and power structures in a society.
So it's not just about being born male or female. It's about all the roles and expectations that society layers on top of that.
Exactly. Think about how we raise children. Boys are often encouraged to be assertive and competitive, while girls are taught to be more nurturing and caring. These early experiences shape how we understand what it means to be masculine or feminine, and those understandings end up affecting everything, even international relations.
That makes a lot of sense. And I imagine those expectations that we have from men and women can really impact everything from who ends up in positions of power to how countries interact with each other on the world stage.
Oh, absolutely. Another critical lens comes from feminist critical theory. This perspective draws a strong link between capitalism and patriarchy, arguing that they work together to keep power imbalances in place. And these imbalances often end up marginalizing and exploiting women.
So it's not just about gender on its own. It's about how it interacts with all these other systems of power and oppression. It makes me think about something I read recently about how global economic policies disproportionately affect women, even though they're often left out of the decision-making process.
That's a perfect example of how feminist critical theory plays out in the real world. And it shows why it's so important to look at global issues through a lens that considers gender, economics, and power all together. And there are even more perspectives out there. Postmodern/post-structuralist feminism, it actually challenges the whole idea that gender categories are fixed. It argues that gender identities are fluid, complex, and always evolving.
So instead of trying to put everyone into these neat little boxes of male and female, this perspective is saying we should see gender as this whole spectrum of identities and expressions.
Exactly. It highlights how diverse the experiences are within and across genders, and it pushes us to move beyond those overly simplistic binaries. And then there's post-colonial feminism.
Yeah.
It brings in a really important dimension to this whole discussion. It emphasizes how gender intersects with things like race, ethnicity, and the legacies of colonialism.
So, for example, a woman's experience in, say, rural India might be totally different from a woman's experience in a big Western city. The challenges they face, the opportunities they have, and even the ways they find empowerment might all be shaped by their own unique cultural and historical context.
Exactly. Post-colonial feminism reminds us that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to gender equality. What might be seen as liberating in one place might not be in another.
All of this is incredibly insightful, but I'm always curious to see how all this theory actually plays out in the real world, especially for our UPSC aspirants out there who need to connect these academic concepts to real events. Do you have any examples of how these gender dynamics actually influence what happens on the global stage?
Of course. We don't even have to look that far. The 2002 Gujarat riots in India are a really stark example of how gender plays out in a conflict. These were really horrific communal riots between Hindus and Muslims. There was widespread violence, and people were forced from their homes.
I remember reading about those riots. They were especially disturbing because of all the targeted sexual violence that was directed at Muslim women.
Right. There were a shocking number of cases of rape, sexual assault, and even women being burned alive. It's this chilling reminder of how gendered violence can be used as a way to terrorize, humiliate, and control people.
And it wasn't just random acts of violence either. It seemed very systematic, targeted, almost strategic in its brutality. It's really upsetting to think that women's bodies were literally battlegrounds in this conflict.
Absolutely. And if we connect this back to those theoretical frameworks we talked about earlier, we can see how different perspectives might interpret these events. A realist might focus on the breakdown of law and order and how the state failed to protect its citizens. A liberal might emphasize the violation of individual rights and the need for laws that actually protect vulnerable groups.
And someone looking at it from a feminist critical theory perspective would probably point to the deep-seated patriarchal structures that allowed this violence to happen. They'd argue that the riots exposed how women's bodies are often used to assert dominance and control within a society.
Exactly. The Gujarat riots are this tragic but powerful example of how gender isn't just some side issue. It's woven into conflict, power, and identity politics.
So for our listeners, especially those preparing for the UPSC exams, this case study shows how important it is to go beyond those simple explanations. You need to be able to analyze events from different perspectives and consider how things like gender, religion, and socioeconomic conditions all come together to create these really complex situations.
Exactly. And developing that kind of analytical approach is crucial not just for understanding things that have already happened, but also for anticipating challenges that are coming and coming up with solutions that actually work.
It's really clear that to understand international relations, we absolutely have to understand gender dynamics. But what does all this mean for those of us who want to live a more peaceful and equitable world? Like, how can we take all these theoretical insights and turn them into something we can actually do something with?
That's the question, isn't it? It's where we move from just thinking about things to actually taking action. If we look at things through a lens that's sensitive to gender, it can really change how we approach diplomacy, conflict resolution, and even international development.
Can you give some concrete examples? How would a more gender-sensitive approach work in those areas?
Sure, let's take peacekeeping, for example. For a long time, peacekeeping has been seen as something that men do. But if we bring in a gender perspective, we start to recognize that women experience conflict differently than men do, and they have unique insights and skills that can contribute to building peace.
So we need to move beyond just sending troops in to keep things under control. We have to think about the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women and girls in these conflict zones, right?
Exactly. It means making sure that women are a real part of the peace negotiations and that their voices are actually heard. It also means tackling issues like sexual violence and making sure that the aid and recovery programs take gender into account.
And how about international development? How does this gender-aware lens change how we try to reduce poverty and improve health outcomes?
Well, for years, development programs mainly focused on growing the economy as the key to progress. But a gender-aware approach sees that women often face systemic barriers when it comes to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities.
So it's not enough to just pour money into a country's economy. We have to understand the specific challenges that women are facing and empower them to be a part of development.
Precisely. It's about things like Investing in girls' education, ensuring women have access to healthcare and financial resources, and challenging laws and practices that are discriminatory. When you empower women, you empower entire communities.
Wow. This deep dive has really been eye-opening. We started off thinking about gender as kind of a niche topic, and now we see it as this fundamental force shaping the world.
It's true, gender isn't just a category, it's this dynamic process that interacts with power, culture, and economics.
And for those of you listening who are preparing for the UPSC exams, this deep dive shows you that the world is much more complicated than any one theory can explain. You need to be able to look at things from different angles, think critically, and connect the dots between theory and what's happening in the real world.
It's all about developing those analytical skills so you can understand these complex global challenges and come up with new and innovative solutions.
As we wrap up today, I want to leave you all with something to think about. Imagine a world where gender equality isn't just something we hope for, but something that's real. What would that world look like? What amazing possibilities would open up?
That's a really powerful question. I hope it inspires all of us to think critically and act bravely to create a world that's more just and equitable for everyone.
And don't forget, the journey of learning doesn't stop here. Be sure to like and subscribe to The Deep Dive for even more deep dives into the big issues shaping our world. Until next time, keep those minds curious and keep your perspectives open.